In the early 1950s, across Minnesota, a frontier emerged that would change the public perception of alcoholism and revolutionize treatment for millions. Following nearly a century of temperance and prohibition movements in the US, alcoholism was seen as a character flaw with no viable treatment options. Rejecting this harmful assumption, 3 treatment centers in Minnesota, Pioneer House, Hazelden, and Wilmer State Hospital, pioneered a new frontier in alcoholism treatment that would come to be known as the Minnesota Model of Addiction Treatment. Utilizing Alcoholics Anonymous principles, a caring environment, and a multidisciplinary approach, the Minnesota model paved the way for dignified and effective alcoholism treatment at a time of immense social stigma around alcohol. Today, the Minnesota model has become the framework for thousands of treatment programs around the world and has advanced the idea that people struggling with addiction are worthy of dignified and respectful care. America has had a tumultuous history with alcohol. In colonial times, the average American drank over 7 gallons of liquor annually, almost 3 times modern rates, leading to the first calls for moderation. Early temperance and prohibition movements were highly religious, depicting alcohol as demon rum and alcoholics as moral degenerates of society. This harsh public sentiment provided a moral justification for national prohibition from 1919 to 1933. Despite a reduction in alcohol consumption during Prohibition, drinking quickly rebounded and posed a growing social issue, with as many as 9 out of every 10 arrests in some cities being for drunkenness in 1934. Following nearly 100 years of prohibition and social stigmas around alcoholism, there were essentially no treatment options for alcoholics other than overcrowded city jails or state inebriate asylums. In the 1930s and 40s, treatment began to shift to the individual in the form of mutual aid groups. The most prominent of these groups, Alcoholics Anonymous, was founded by Bill W. and Dr. Bob Smith in 1935. They created a 12-step program to overcome alcoholism, emphasizing spirituality and group accountability to recover. Alcoholics Anonymous quickly spread across the country, reaching 100,000 alcoholics recovered through AA by 1950. Despite this early success, AA was not an all-encompassing solution. Doctors viewed it as too simplistic to work, clergy worried it was a conflicting religion, and the general public and alcoholics were largely indifferent. However, the simple idea that alcoholics could help each other recover through group conversation would go on to completely change the approach of alcoholism treatment. Drawing from this idea, Pat Cronin pushed for the creation of one of the first city-funded treatment programs as an alternative to jail time. In 1948, Pioneer House was established as a division of the Public Assistance Board of the City of Minneapolis and treated 200 patients in its first year. The new approach of applying AA principles to an intensive treatment program quickly proved to be more effective than the never-ending cycle of drinking and jail. In 1949, the Hazelden Treatment Center opened in Center City, Minnesota, as a private treatment option. Like Pioneer House, Hazelden taught AA principles and used recovered alcoholics as counselors. In the first 20 months, Hazelden reported a 78% recovery rate, a stark improvement from the essentially non-existent treatment outcomes in jails or state inebriate hospitals. While Pioneer House and Hazelden found some success treating alcoholism on a small scale, across the country, overcrowding of alcoholics in city jails reinforced harmful stereotypes that alcoholism was not treatable or even worthy of dignified care. For many, state inebriate hospitals were often the only treatment available. Referred to as snake pits, these hospitals were ineffective and commonly used cruel practices and locked wards. In 1950, Wilmer State Hospital was the only Minnesota hospital required to admit alcoholics and provided essentially no treatment other than a brief detoxification before long-term custodial care. Beginning in July 1950, under the guidance of newly hired doctors Nelson Bradley and Daniel Anderson, Wilmer launched their modern chemical dependency unit. Drawing inspiration from the early success of Pioneer House and Hazelden, they taught AA principles, used recovered alcoholics as counselors, and unlocked patient wards. With this combination of treatment methods, Wilmer State Hospital opened a new frontier in chemical dependency treatment by pioneering the multidisciplinary approach of the Minnesota model.
Addiction is a multiphasic illness, physical, psychological, social, spiritual, and you need a multidisciplinary staff to intervene, focus on the addiction, make it a caring model, not a curing model, and do some of that, and with short-term and long-term goals. And the whole idea was to try to develop some kind of structure that made sense.
The chemical dependency unit at Wilmer succeeded in humanizing the treatment at the state hospital, and their nearly 30% escape rate soon turned into a 30% recovery rate. Wilmer's revolutionary new mix of AA principles and multidisciplinary staff quickly attracted nationwide attention from doctors and counselors attempting to replicate their success by implementing the working principles of the Minnesota model. While the most severe cases of alcoholism ended up at Wilmer, the Hazelden Treatment Center, first opened in 1949, aimed to reach alcoholics before Skid Row and poverty. Originally designed as a treatment center for alcoholic businessmen, Hazelden was privately funded and had a caring and family-like atmosphere, fostered primarily by Patrick Butler, the first president of Hazelden. Under Pat Butler's direction, the early years of Hazelden had a few simple expectations of patients: attend lectures, participate in group sessions, and make your bed.
What happened once you got here?
Well, I came in, and I think the first impression was the tender, loving care. They didn't treat me like a degenerate or a charity case or something like this. I was made to feel that I was wanted here.
Hazelden's founding principles of dignity and respect for alcoholics brought them early success in the 1950s. The simple idea that people struggling with alcoholism could help each other recover through genuine conversation was fostered by the caring environment at Hazelden and became a key principle of the Minnesota model. As Hazelden grew in the 1960s and 70s, they continued to push the frontier of dignified addiction treatment, expanding to provide women's programs, youth care, and family involvement. In 1960, Dr. Daniel Anderson officially joined Hazelden, bringing the psychology and multidisciplinary approach of the Minnesota model developed at Wilmer. Under his leadership as president, Hazelden developed a standardized Minnesota model treatment program, combining the AA principles used at Pioneer House, multidisciplinary approach from Wilmer, and the core of respectful and dignified treatment developed at Hazelden. Dr. Dan Anderson frequently delivered lectures on Hazelden's treatment program, exporting the Minnesota model across the country and world. By 1986, 95% of all alcohol and drug treatment programs in the U.S. were in some form based upon the Minnesota model of addiction treatment. Additionally, individualized care and the multidisciplinary approach pioneered at Hazelden and Wilmer have become commonplace in any addiction or mental health treatment program today. At the time the Minnesota model was invented, there were very few alternatives other than jail or state inebriate asylums. In recent years, a new movement, critical of the Minnesota model, has begun to gain traction. The harm reduction movement was first popularized during the 1980s AIDS crisis and aims to reduce alcohol or drug use based on an individual's personal goals, rather than strict abstinence. While harm reduction and the Minnesota model have historically been at odds, harm reduction draws from the core ideas of a multidisciplinary approach and individualized and respectful care first pioneered by the Minnesota model in the 1950s. Ultimately, the Minnesota model of addiction treatment is a collection of perspectives on treatment, open-ended and ever-evolving. While it was never designed to be the only or best treatment method, the Minnesota model opened the frontier of dignified addiction recovery treatment at a time of immense social stigmas around alcohol. From humble beginnings at 3 unrelated treatment centers, the Minnesota model has developed into a major social reform movement that has humanized America's view of alcoholism.